Hi folks, Harry Frank from Red Giant here. In this tutorial, we'll be assembling this logo animation that you see here. As you can see, there's lots of particles going on with the logo, as well as some Trapcode Lux off in the background. But more specifically, we'll be talking about a new feature found in Adobe After Effects called Master Properties. This is a workflow enhancement that allows us to work with one composition that we define as our template. And then as I use this composition elsewhere, we'll be able to define very specific properties that are available to be changed and that we can make changes to. But none of these changes will impact the original animation. So we can make an unlimited number of variations. I can change particle size, I can change the overall color, I can even change out the logo that I've got defined. So in this case, where we've got one logo animation and we'd perhaps want to change this to 4 different logos or even 400, we can easily make the changes and keep all of our design decisions centralized within one composition. So this is much better shown than described, so let's jump into a new composition and get to work here. In this tutorial, I'll be assuming that you have not used the Essential Graphics or Master Properties features before, but the assumption I am making is that we have some sort of logo artwork to work with. So in my case, I've got 4 different logos in Illustrator, and I have them all centered on my document, and I have them all on different layers. So I'm going to import these into After Effects. We'll go to my vector folder here, import my hockey logos. I'll import these as a composition, and I'll use the layer size as the footage dimensions. Next, I'll make a new composition, and this will hold my master logo animation. This is going to be the template composition. And I'll drop my hockey logos in here and make this a 3D layer. I need another element, which is my icy floor. So I'm just going to grab an ice texture here that's fairly large. Also drag this into my comp and also make that 3D. I'll rotate this on its x-axis, set it to 90 degrees in the x rotation, and drag this down below the logos. Next, I'll make a camera, and I'm going to start making some lighting to light my scene here. So to adjust my light position, I'm going to jump over to the custom view, number 1. And now that I've switched my camera view, I can tap escape to jump back and forth between my 2 camera views here. So I'll make one spotlight here. And this first spotlight is going to point right at the logo itself, and it's going to illuminate it and cast a bit of a shadow down onto the floor. So I'll hit OK here, and there's my light. It isn't exactly illuminating a whole lot, but we'll work with it. Now what I'm going to do with this light is lock its point of interest to the logo layer itself. So the spotlight itself should have a point of interest under its transform options right here. We can also access this by tapping A for a point of interest. And I'm going to link this to the position of my hockey logo. So I want to link the XYZ of the point of interest to the XYZ of the position. Now I could create an expression for this, or I can just jump over to the property pick whip, which is in our parent and link column, and target the position of the logos. So now if I move my logo around, my light is going to follow it. I'm going to take this light position itself and move it up. So the position of the light is one thing, so that's its actual position, the source of the light. The point of interest is where the light is looking. So we have it up and pointing down at the logo, and we don't see a whole lot going on. Now your first thought might be to adjust the overall intensity of the light, but that's not really our problem here. I could turn up this intensity, and we see a little bit more going on. What's happening is that the fall off of the light, the radius of the fall off, it does not have enough distance to actually reach the logo. So we need to increase the fall off radius here. So if I bring this up, we'll see it hit the logo and then start to spill onto the floor. Again, we'll be adding more lights to the scene, so this doesn't have to do everything, but we do want to illuminate the logo, and we also want it to cast a shadow onto the floor. So this light is currently set to cast shadows. We also need to make sure that the 3D layer itself is also casting shadows. So I'll go in here to the material options and make sure this is set to cast shadows. So we're going to make a few adjustments to position and scale here, so I'm not going to fine-tune that too much just yet. But I will go to the spotlight light options and turn up the overall shadow diffusion to kind of soften that shadow on the floor. Okay. Now next, before I get too far, I'm going to go inside this hockey logos folder, and I'm going to scale the logos themselves up quite a bit. So if I select all of these and tap S to scale and slide this up, I'm going to fill this composition about as much as I can. And there's a reason for this that is very specific, but it's getting ahead of ourselves, so we're going to come back to the why on this in just a couple minutes. But I do want to scale these up, and because I've scaled them up quite a bit, I do want to click on Continuously Rasterize for the layers to maintain their quality. Now, I'm just going to turn all of these off except for one so we can just see one of these logos. And if I jump back to my composition here, we can see that it's actually a little bit too big and spilling into our floor. That's fine. I'm going to go to the scale for the hockey logos and actually bring this down. So I know that seems a little bit roundabout to scale it up inside the pre-comp and then scale it back down outside of the pre-comp. But once we use this as a particle emitter, this will help out, and I'll explain why when we get to that point. Okay, so I've got my logos, I've got my light, and I'm going to add a few more lights to this scene. I'm going to add a dedicated point light right to the front of the logo just to directly illuminate. I guess it could be a spotlight as well. I'm using a point light so it can also kind of direct some of its light down to the floor as well. So I'm creating a new point light, and we don't need this one to cast shadows. So I'm going to drag this over fairly close to the logo. And I'm going to parent it. So when the logo moves, the light moves with it. Now, in the render that I showed you, there was some visible light, some actual volumetric light in the background. And this is done using Trapcode Lux, which is a plugin. And this works in conjunction with After Effects lights. So I'm going to start by making my Lux layer. So I'm going to make a comp size layer, call this Lux. The color really doesn't matter, but I tend to make these black. And I'll drag this down just behind the camera. I'll go to Effect, RG Trapcode, and Apply Lux. So we've got one light in here. We can see it's a little bit off camera, so it's not actually doing a whole lot, but we'll kind of bump up the overall intensity of that light. We will also see that Trapcode Lux is rendering where the point light is. We can simply turn that off by going to Point Lights and using the Point Light model off. So I'm going to make two more lights and put them out in the corners over here. So let's again tap Escape, and I'll go to my Spotlight. I'm going to duplicate this and hit P to show my position. So we'll move this forward in Z, which is a positive direction. And then I'm going to move it to the right in the X-axis. Now I'm going to jump back to my camera view and get this exactly where it should be, which is kind of over here in the corner. So there's one. Command D to duplicate one more time. Grab this X-axis, and I'll flip it over on the other side over here. Pretty straightforward. Now these look okay, but the reach of the lights, the fall off, is happening too soon. It's not really filling a whole lot here. So I'm going to go to Lux, go to the Spotlights section, and I can increase the reach here manually as well. So I'll turn this up and kind of fill our scene a bit more. I'm going to switch to a half resolution render here and show you that as I drag and move this logo around, the lights are all following it, following the position of the logo, which is pretty cool. Next, I'll do some simple position keyframing with the logo. So I want it to fly in, and I'll have it land right at 1 second. So I've created a keyframe there. And then starting at 4 seconds, I'll have it fly out. So I need another keyframe right there. So at 0 frames, I'll have this start off screen left. And that will fly in and land right there. We'll fine tune these keyframes in just a little bit. And then here at the end, after 4 seconds, we'll have it fly. I'm going to have it fly toward the camera a bit and off to the right. So I'll just kind of keep working X and Z to get this in the right position. Okay, so we definitely don't want to leave those as linear keyframes. I'm going to right click and select Separate Dimensions, and we'll fine tune the X position movement here. I'll select this second keyframe here, and we'll have it ease in. This very, very first keyframe, I can just drag this handle straight up because we don't see its starting point. We don't care so much that it is having an abrupt movement at the beginning. We just kind of want it to slow to a stop. And then out here, let's do the same thing. We'll have it kind of ease out, and then we'll fine tune this last keyframe right here. It looks like it's kind of hitting the camera a little bit, but that should go away once we fine tune the Z position as well. So I'm going to drag this out and fine tune this last keyframe like so. Okay, just to clean things up, let's get rid of any stray keyframes that don't need to be here. So that will include those two right there, and then nothing in the Y-axis is animated, so I'll just remove those. So now we'll have this logo emit particles, so I'll make a solid for particular. And I'll apply RG Trapcode Particular. So we're going to have particular use the layer itself, its position, scale, rotation, as well as the color of the layer to emit particles. So I'll go to the emitter section and set the emitter type to be a layer. Let's give ourselves a little bit more room to work with here. And in the layer emitter section, I'll define the layer to be the hockey logos, and we should see a couple particles start emitting from that. Layer sampling we'll leave set to still, that's fine, and the layer RGB usage is set to RGB particle color. What this means is that particles are being generated using the space and position and scale of this layer. Any particle that's born from any given point will inherit the color from the layer at that point. So if it's born from a purple area, we'll have a purple. If a particle is born from a white area, the particle will be white. Now, what this means is that we don't have any other control over the particle color. Once we set this to inherit the color from the layer, that's basically the particle color. So we might just drop a tint effect on here later on to control particle color. But first, let's just fine tune some things with the layer emitter. I mentioned earlier that we want to optimize the size of the image inside the pre-comp when we're using it as a layer emitter. And that's simply because when we have a lot of blank space inside a layer emitter, it is using the layer very inefficiently. So we're going to have a number of wasted particles that are rendering from this layer. So it's just kind of an inefficiency. So it's a good practice to try to maximize the space inside your layer emitter when you're using layer emitters with Particular. That said, you're still going to have a pretty high particles per second count when using layer emitters. Now I'll set this to 35,000 for now, and this might seem like a lot, but as we make changes, this is going to be less and less drastic. So first I'll go to the particle size, and I think the particle size is a little bit big. I'll set this to maybe 2.5 for now. And I'm going to go to the size over life and set this so that it scales out over time, so it doesn't sort of pop and disappear at the end. And we've already kind of gotten rid of a lot of the overall heaviness of that particle effect. In fact, we could probably go in here and boost the particles per second count back up. Now, the default lifespan of 3 seconds is probably pretty high for a really short animation like we're doing, so I'm going to lower that to 1.5, and I'll set the life random to 50%. I think it's always a good idea to add a little bit of life randomness to your particles. Now, as I park it right about here, I want to zoom in on these particles a little bit. We're randomly generating particles all over the surface of this layer, and you can see their distribution kind of looks like a noise. It's kind of a random noise like this. Now, to make it feel a bit more organic, I'm going to go to the physics section under air turbulence field and turn up the effect position property. And this is going to use a 3D fractal field and kind of push and pull and bunch together the particles and make them feel a bit more like they are swirling in the air rather than just kind of being distributed via a random noise function. So if I turn this up, let's say I set this to 200, and then I set this back down to 0, you can see that it has a much more organic feel bunching them together and having that sort of turbulent kind of feel using this turbulence. Now, when I was making this, one thing I liked doing was actually taking the main particles that you're seeing here. So right now, what you're seeing, we're going to call these the main particles. And I'm going to go to a section called the aux system and set this to emit continuously. And what this is going to do is turn all of these main particles into particle emitters themselves. This does result in a lot of particles. First and foremost, we probably should take the size and turn this way down. So I'll set the size to 2. And I also will go to the color from main and turn this up to 100% so that the aux particles are inheriting the same color as the main particles. As you can see, it does result in a lot more particles, but the movement of the aux system is going to be a little bit different than the main particles. These aux particles are kind of trailing off of the main particles rather than emitting from the layer emitter. So it gives it sort of a streaky, smoky kind of feel. Also, just like we did before, we should have these scale over time so that they are kind of trailing off like that. So if I turn this off and then back on, we can see that these aux particles are kind of trailing off of those main particles. And I think for a kind of a smoky, icy kind of animation like this, it does help. Also, I'm seeing that the overall blend of the particles could be improved. Right now, the layer itself that we are using for the particles, I'm going to move this down actually below the Lux layer. This is set to a normal blend mode. I would recommend with particles always setting the particles to a screen blend mode. This isn't going to have a huge impact, but generally I would also go to the particle itself and set that to a blend mode such as screen or add. So that is the particles as they interact with each other. Those are being set to screen as well. And also we have a separate blend for the aux system. So again, I'll set that one to screen. So now we've got kind of a nice smoky, icy kind of particle flow coming off of our logo layer. Now, as this animates into place, it's going to sit there and continue to generate particles. Now, if this is a look that you are okay with, great. I think it's a bit much for me personally. So while this sits, the logo sits in place, I'm going to animate the particles from its high number down to a lower number. So I'll set a keyframe right here just before it lands. And then right after the logo lands in place, I'll set this to maybe 10,000 particles per second. So if I move forward in time, we'll see that there's a lot fewer particles around the logo. So from here, as the logo animates outward, I'll have the particles per second animate back up. So I'll just copy these and paste them. Right click, select Keyframe Assistant, and select Time Reverse Keyframes, and I'll flip those back around. I'll move these back just a little bit to give it some extra time to sort of ramp up the particles per second. I'll do a couple quick things that I did in my final. One is using an effect that's actually outside of Trapcode here. This is totally optional. Under Universe Text, there's a plugin called Luster. Now, if you use this on text, it kind of generates a shiny surface to the text, and it usually looks pretty good. But on a logo like this, we can go to the source and set it to the original and just kind of use this bevel highlight across the surface. Let me solo this like that. And there's a start and end position control that defines where this highlight reflection is. So I'll just kind of keep it across the front like that. Not totally necessary for this, but I think it looks pretty good for a logo. Next, I should add some pretty deep depth of field to our camera. So if I go into my camera options here, we've got our depth of field on. The aperture isn't very drastic, so I'm going to turn this aperture up quite a bit so that we can see sort of a blurred foreground and background. But we've also blurred our logo layer, and we've blurred our particles. So we need to put that stuff into focus. And there's a very easy way to do this. If I select the camera and I select the logo, which is a 3D layer, I want that logo area to be in focus, and I go to Layer Camera, and I can either link the focus to that layer using expressions, or I can just do a one-time set focus to that layer, and I think that will be just fine. All right, so we've got everything in focus. We've got our lux layers. We've got our particle layers going on. So let's talk about templating this. And actually, this will probably be a pretty good time to save. I'm going to call this Hockey Logos tutorial. This is my second attempt at it. The scenario I'm using here is that I would like to be able to change out the logo, change out things like color, particle size, and maybe particles per second, so I can kind of fine-tune it later and make lots of different variations on this. So the way we do this is by adding properties to the Essential Graphics panel. So I'll show you an example here. If I go into the particle section and I right-click on the size, this is my particle size, and I say Add Property to Essential Graphics. We've introduced this composition to Essential Graphics. We've added our first property in here, which is our particle size. And I can change this here, and this will impact the particle size. But this is actually only one of a couple steps here. Also, I want to rename this Hockey Logo Animations, just so that I don't have an untitled name up there. Okay, so I'm going to take my master composition here, my master logo animation, and I'll drop this into a new composition. And let's say this is our first version of the logo animations, which, as we can see, this is the Rhinos logo. So I'm going to call this the Rhinos. If I twirl this open, we can see that we've got master properties here. And if I turn this particle size up to 8, we'll have much bigger particles rendering. But if I go back to the original, this is unchanged. We have not made any changes to the original. We've only made changes to the property that has been made available through Essential Graphics, and it shows up in the master properties. So I can add all kinds of things like particle color, particles per second, perhaps a background color or overall tint, all kinds of things that I'd like to make variations on using this as a template. So let's do another one. Let's say we want particles per second. Now, I've animated the particles per second, so this makes things a little bit more complicated than particle size. So if I add this to the Essential Graphics, I'm going to be changing something that's already animated, so that's probably not a good idea. But what I can do is create sort of a centralized control that I can use. So I'm going to make a null object, and I'm going to rename this controls. To this, I'm going to add the expression control, the slider control. And I'll name this particle density. And I'll set this to a default of 1. So instead of controlling the keyframe value, what I can do is just control something that might be a multiplier to the particles per second. This makes a really easy way to kind of control how many particles we see. So I can take the existing value and multiply it times this slider value here. And this gives us a really easy control for our particles. So I need to make an expression here for our particles per second. And I can use the existing keyframed value just by typing the word value, and then I'll multiply this by that slider. Now, this is a classic problem here where I haven't made it actually visible. So now my slider is visible. Now I need to add that value here by using the pick whip. I'm going to grab this and I'll go right up here to the slider. And now we've grabbed the slider value. Here, I'll tap tilde so we can see this. So value is the existing value times the slider value. That's part of the effect that's on the layer controls. That's a part of this comp. So this is all one value here. It isn't any more complicated than that. So if I set this to 2, this will double the particle count. If I set this to 4, this will multiply the particle count by 4. So if I add this to our essential graphics, and I can rename this, say, particle density, and in my copy here, I can go into particle density, control that, and now I've doubled the number of particles in the copy, but we haven't changed it in the template. So I'm going to add another thing, which would be perhaps particle color. Now, generally, I control particle color by going to the particle section and controlling the particle color right here where it says set color. But in this case, we're assigning the color from the logo. So I'm going to cheat a little bit. Rather than adding yet another particle layer on top of that and rendering a separate pass of particles, I'm simply going to apply a tint effect to this. And this will render much more quickly. So we'll go to color correction tint, and we'll map the white to something. So I'll say add this property to essential graphics, and then we'll be able to tint the particles a certain color. I can also say amount to tint. Let's add this as well so we can kind of control the tint amount. So rather than calling this map white to, we'll call this particle tint. And maybe particle tint amount. So for this version, perhaps we want to pull in a little bit more of a purple to separate it a bit from the logo, but maybe we don't want it all the way. Let's say we set this to just 50% or so. So again, we're adding lots of flexibility in our animation here, and we'll be able to control this in every single composition. Pretty cool. Now in this composition, I don't think I've added any sort of background back there. Yeah, so this is really just kind of transparency back there. So I'm going to add one more solid to put in the background, and make sure this is the size of the composition. Put this all the way in the back, and I'm going to render a gradient ramp to this. So I'll just put a subtle color on here. We'll set this to a radial ramp, swap these colors around, and use some sort of color that we'll be able to define in the template. I'm actually grabbing, so there's 2-point controls here. There is one up here. This is the start color of the radial ramp, and this is the end color. And this color right here can be a lot darker. It's just kind of a subtle color that we can put in the background. So that is a background color that we can also add to our essential graphics. So this is background color. Cool. So pretty straightforward stuff, right? We're just kind of modifying colors and percentages and basic sliders. I haven't edited any of these ranges here, so I'd like to do that real quick. Particle size, we could probably limit to, let's say 10. So it's from 0 to 10. Particle density, I would say that also a limit of 10 is probably pretty good for that. Now early on, I mentioned the ability to swap out the logo. I've only made one iteration here, and let's say I want to be able to dynamically swap out this logo and start to make color changes based on the logo. So let's make my copy here. I have another logo in there. This is called the Bulls. So we'll get ready to do that one. So just like I did before where I added a null object and put a slider on that, I'm going to do the same thing here. So this is our controls, and I'm going to add a slider control to this. I'm going to rename this our logo selector. I'll set this to a value of 2 to start. So what I'm going to do is go to the opacity for each of these layers, and I can just write an expression once and paste it to all of our layers. I'll make an opacity expression that looks at the value of this logo selector slider. And if it says if this value is equal to the number of the layer that I'm on, then set the opacity to 100%. And if it's not, set the opacity to 0. So let's make our opacity expression, and I'm going to want to grab the value of the logo selector slider and then assign that to a value. Just to keep things simple, I'm going to assign that just to the letter N, because this is not a very fancy expression. So we're just going to stick with N. So N is the value of our logo selector, and we want to test this. We want to say, okay, is N equal to the current number of the layer? And this is referred to as our index. index is the number of the current layer. So the current layer is number 2. If this condition is true, the first thing outside of the parentheses is what is passed as the value to opacity. So if it's true, make opacity 100. If it's not true, we type else, and then the value to pass when the condition is not true is over here. So we'll say else 0. Now this will mostly work. So right now it's 2 and layer 2 is visible. And if I set this to 3, it's not visible. Great. Well, what happens when it's 2.3? Well, nothing, because there is no layer 2.3. So we need to round the value, and we can do this either up here or we can do it down here. I use a pretty short variable to make this easy. So I'm going to round n right here. So I'm going to say math dot, I could say round, but I'm going to use something called floor. Math dot floor, and in parentheses n. Math dot floor is going to round it to the nearest lower integer. So 2.9 is still going to equal 2. So now if I set this to 2, it works. If I set this to 3, it goes away. So I'll right click on this, select copy expression only. And if I have a million layers in here, I just need to select them all and hit paste. Make sure to turn them on in terms of visibility, because we're not controlling that. We're just controlling opacity. So now if I set this to 3, we'll turn on layer 3. If I set this to 4, we've got layer 4, 5, etc. So now I will be adding this slider to our Essential Graphics panel. So this we will call our logo selector. And again, I don't think we're going to use more than 100 logos, but in your case, that might differ. So if I go to the bulls here, actually, I changed the original. So let's set this to 2. So now our template is using 2. Our rhinos template here is using 2. Our bulls is also using 2. So let's set this to 4. Great. So I'm going to turn down the particle tint amount. I'm going to turn down the particle size. Maybe I'll push in a little warmer of a color, like an orange on the bulls here. And let's turn the particle tint amount, let's say, to 50%. We can change the background color to make that also fit a little bit better, so it's not feeling so purple. There, we've got our bulls. Now in our rhinos, I've kind of, changed things up to the point where it looks pretty ugly just for demonstration purposes. So if I'd like to go through and reset all of these and pull everything from the master composition, I can go right here and pull the parameters back from the original and kind of get rid of the changes that I made. So for our rhinos here, maybe a particle size of 4, maybe particle density of 2. Background color I think is okay, and maybe we want to tint the colors. Well, we definitely don't want to tint them white, but maybe we want to push in just a little bit more of a pink. Maybe I'll set this to like 25%, just a slight tint. If I duplicate and duplicate, we've got eagles, and I've got panthers. Quickly go in here. My logo selector for panthers, I think goes to 3 for the panthers logo. Yep. And for the eagles, this is number 4. There. So push this color, maybe a little bit more red for the eagles, and for panthers, I don't know, maybe kind of a darker gold on the particles. So there, I've got all 4 of my logo variations made, so I can make changes here. More importantly, I can still make changes to the original. I can change my camera view, I could add some color correction, and the changes that I make here are going to ripple out to all of the other compositions. So let's say I add something like Magic Bullet Renoiser and sharpen it a little and add a bit of noise. So I'm going to go in here, add some light noise, set the sharpen to maybe 35% and the grain amount to 40%. So it adds a little bit of sharpening, a little bit of grain out on the sides. So this will ripple out to all of the iterations that I've made with master properties. Really cool. Let's say you wanted to add a color-specific glow. So I'll add a new adjustment layer for our glow, and we could just use a standard After Effects glow. I'll bring down the overall threshold and bring up the radius, and we'll change the glow colors from the original colors to use A and B colors, and we'll change color A here to something slightly different. So we're adding kind of a overall glowy cast to this. So we'll kind of fine-tune the overall intensity and glow radius. Maybe the intensity can come down. And maybe we raise this midpoint, which is essentially kind of a gamma control. So a nice kind of colorized glow is a really cool thing to add here, and we can add this and sort of like call this like tinted glow. So if we go into one of our variations here, we can see the tinted glow is now using a blue, which maybe isn't working great for our Bulls logo, but we can set this to use a little bit warmer of a color. So that's essentially an overview of using master properties and integrating something like Trapcode Particular and setting up an overall logo animation setup that you can easily change with just a few clicks of the mouse and a few changes of sliders and color controls. I hope you explore the master properties feature and use it in your own work. My name is Harry Frank for Red Giant. Thank you so much for watching.